welcome to Wednesday Night Sessions. Thank you for joining us. Thanks again, regular viewers. I know we've got quite a few of you out there. Thanks for joining us again. And to any new viewers or listeners, I understand some people just kind of click play on this and then go do other stuff and listen. Either way works for me. This is Wednesday Night Sessions. It will debut on Wednesday night, but then is available on KickstART Farmington's YouTube page anytime. So whenever you're listening and watching, thanks for being here. I am your host, Mitch Nobis, like usual. And this season is, hopefully, if it all comes together properly, going to be all Michigan writers, either in Michigan or Michigan expatriates, as I kind of lovingly call them, because we have so many phenomenal people who grew up in Michigan and then relocate. So I'm excited because we've been trying to get this episode together for a while. Peter Markus is joining us today. So Peter, I'm going to throw it over to you for a reading. And then like always, new viewers, we have 2 questions after the reading. So Peter, thank you very much for being here today, and take it away.
All right, thanks, Mitch, for having me. This book that I'm going to read from, When Our Fathers Returned to Us as Birds, was published by Wayne State University Press, their Made in Michigan series. I think you focusing your series this year on Michigan writers. There's such an abundance of fine writers in our state, and I was really pleased that this book, which is my most recent publication, was published as part of that series. So many of my favorite writers, not even just Michigan writers, have published books in that series. So I was really happy to have this new book sort of come home. So I'm going to read some poems from it, and I think the poems speak for themselves, so I don't think I need to say anything other than what the poems might say, and then we'll chat about them 10 minutes from now. So this first poem is called The Sentence I Am Trying Not to Write. I am sitting in the dark near the window watching it snow. It is still too early to know if my mother will call to tell me my father is dead. For now he is alive, asleep in his bed with a view of the river. Or maybe he is up early this morning, looking out at the 5 swans that move through the watery dark, their long necks bent like question marks, the silence of the hour asking, will today be the day? Meanwhile, the sun rises like a gigantic period at the end of the sentence I am trying not to write. This next poem, What My Father Did Not Have to Say. In his final days, my father did not speak because he could not speak. He did not ask how the car was running or about the kids or his granddog. He did not ask about work. He did not look out at the boats on the river to say, there goes a 32-footer, or the lines on that boat are really fine. He did not say the water was at its highest in 25 years. If his thin lips moved at all, it was only when I wiped them with a wet washcloth or put yogurt on a spoon up to them, hoping he would eat. He did not eat and he did not speak, and soon his breathing slowed until there was nothing. He'd been slowly dying and now he was dead. I did not know what to say, and so I said little out loud. I walked down to the river where I thought maybe I would find something there to tell me what I was supposed to do now. The loons sat on the water and dove under when a boat motored close by. They did not sing, not right then at least. Only later at night did they call out to each other, their voices crisscrossing the river in the April dark. On my morning walk, I question what I see. All that I saw today along the road, I asked if it was my father. Each tree leaning over me, each leaf, every stone I toed with my boot, branches broken off in the night's hard rain, even the clouds and birds flying beneath them. Are you my father? Is this what you have become? What I know is not my father. My father lives now not in a house, but in the river and on this boat beside me as I cut the engine and drift down river past the steel mill and the hospital where no one has died or walked away in close to 20 years. So much of what remains with us is just the husk or skin of what once was. The urn in my pocket is mostly just something small for me to hold. I know it's not my father, even though it is his bones ground down to a fine white ash. My father is more in the river and sky, the great blue heron on the rocky shore, the osprey flying overhead, the seagull on a tree floating beside us. We know there are fish in these dark waters, even though we cannot see them. Sometimes when I snag bottom, I am fooled for a moment that it's a fish. But a fish is alive in your hands the moment you set the hook. The way it shakes its head as if to say, I'm not going without a fight. My father held on longer than he could. In the end, he pulled his knees in up to his stomach and went to sleep. Eventually, his breathing stopped. I was reminded of when I was a child up north, the first time I hooked and caught a catfish. 4 hours later, sucking at summer's cruel air, about to be gutted in the kitchen sink, this fish refused to die. It flared its boned fins even after I slid the fillet knife inside it. Even after I chopped off its head, when I tossed what was left of it out into the yard for the raccoons to eat, I saw its whiskers move, its black eyes opened wide, staring up from the ground at a sky that was suddenly radiant with light. One last poem. I did what I could to keep this. I am here to translate my father's death into fruit, something that can be held, to bring it up to your lips the way I spooned strawberry yogurt up to his and said to him the word eat. There was no use in the end. There was no hunger. When you are 86 and stop eating, you die. On his death certificate, under cause of death, the word malnutrition. I did what I could to keep this from my mother. When she saw it, I watched her face. What was left inside her went to someplace else. I said something to her to make sure she knew it wasn't her fault. There was nothing she could do. It means that he stopped eating, is all I said. My mother nodded. My father later zipped into a bag and taken away from us forever. The man who did the zipping took me by the elbow to tell me we might not want to watch. I took my mother into the other room, then went back because I wanted to see. My mother returned to see too. They wrapped my father up in a sheet my mother had recently washed. It smelled of lavender and bleach. I had shaved my father minutes after he drew his last breath, wiped his face clean in a way that pleased my mother. It was the least I could do. Later, when I asked if she was hungry, she shook her head to tell me no. I'd slept on the carpeted floor the night before my father's last, kept watch asleep in my clothes behind the couch beside his bed. If I dreamed, I don't remember. I don't remember more than this little bit I am trying to hold, this small fruit, a single grape pulled from the cluster in the fridge. They put my father into a van and headed south along the river. The road to the bridge gets bumpy, was all I told them after they shut the rear doors where they slid inside the narrow gurney with my father's dead body on it. He had already started to become something else. In the darkness at the edge of that road, I stood for a little while before walking down to the river where the dark water moved in its usual ways, as if it were following my father, going under the bridge they drove across as they took him even further away. That'll do it.
Wow. Thank you so much for that reading, Peter. We kind of always say thank you to writers, but I feel like it's like a deeper or different thank you for you. I'm a member of what we commonly call Generation X, and my wife and I were just talking the other day about how we're kind of entering that stage where you can see where we can see our parents as more mortal than we did, younger. Like when you're young, you view your parents as gods, sort of. And as we all age, you start to realize like we are all mere mortals. I feel like your book is going to be very valuable for a lot of us in the coming years as we reach those points in life, those milestones, whatever you want to call it. That's very powerful stuff. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah. When I was writing that book or writing those poems, or at least sitting down and reading, and the act of reading sort of invited me to enter into the conversation with these other poets who had also written about just what we're talking about, death and mortality. I for the first time in my life as a writer, I was like, you know what, I think these pages, and I wasn't even thinking necessarily book, but I was thinking, maybe for the first time, these words that I'm writing could be of use to other people in a way that, prior to writing this book of poems, I was a fiction writer, and I was just sort of, it was more about play, and it was more about language, and it was more about invention. In this book, I knew I was telling something really true and something real. And that I was like, you know what, this book, which is clearly about loss and grief and love and the fact that we're all going to die, this book might actually have its place in the world, and again, be something that not just readers of poetry might actually like say, you know what, like these poems speak to me in a way that maybe other poems fail to, because they're poems, and so often, so much of poetry, at least to the general reader, is something that we don't understand. And yet I knew I was writing a poem or poems, and I couldn't stop writing these poems, but I just felt that stylistically they were speaking to just real people. And I've had that, in the response from readers have been just that, this book, really sort of speaks to their own particular losses as well. And that means a lot.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like poetry gets kind of unfairly derided often as just wordplay or something, and not, a tool is an overly simplistic word, but like a tool that helps us survive, that helps us
Mhm,
make sense of it all. I mean, it's what any literature does ultimately.
mhm.
You kind of
Yeah,
already started
I
getting
would
into
hope
it.
so. Yeah,
Yeah, I mean,
I hope that
still,
literature sort of, just isn't recreation. I just, there's baseball and hockey for that, like we've talked prior to the
yeah,
recording, but and there's great value in those things, but like words can really, change or just help other people move through that grieving process. And I've had folks sort of, tell me that. And that's, like I've had people say nice things about my fiction too, that it inspired them or, made them uh, believe that they whatever. But like, real people saying like, I'm thinking of this one woman, and very specifically, I did a reading through the Detroit writing room, I think it's called, and it's a Zoom sort of, or it was a Zoom format. And this woman I remember from Windsor, and she came off mute and she was like, Peter, I just want to let you know that I read every word in your book. Right? And she kind of had this very slow, deliberate, very poetic way of delivering her own words. And she goes, I read every word in your book, and I just want to let you know. She kind of heavy pause. And I'm like, okay, this could go any one of which ways, right? Like this, she could be saying, I just want to let you know that you don't know what you're talking about. She
yeah,
goes, I just want you to know that, you know, what you wrote about your experience with your father and his dying, um, was this, exactly the same as what I felt and went through, recently with the dying of my mother. And, ultimately it was a thank you, like, thank you, because it just helped me also move through the process. And hopefully even like, okay, maybe it even gave her the permission to write her own book of poems about it.
that's fantastic. I mean, it's obviously powerful, but also I love the way that words are kind of contagious in that
Yeah,
way.
you hope so. I mean, that's why I always, you know, I begin my day by, before I start writing, I start reading,
Yeah.
and it's just, it's like, um, there's a poem that I teach often called A River by the Polish poet Adam Zagajewski, I think is how you pronounce it. And, he just talks about like poems from poems, stories from stories, um, paintings from paintings, always this healthy impregnation that occurs between these things. So, yeah, that's, one of the reasons why we read and write, and we want to give something, to other people and say, you can do this too. It's why I teach. Like I want my students to be empowered to believe that they have stories to tell as well. I guess we haven't really gotten into any questions. We're just sort of having a conversation, which I think is cool. But I didn't know if you had any specific questions either, Mitch. It's up to you.
Well, I have two prepped, and you've started to touch on both of them, so you can ignore or follow them as you see fit. You kind of already started talking about how you are known as a fiction writer, and then this came out as poetry. And I'm always fascinated by the behind the scenes process questions. When I'm reading interviews, watching interviews, like I'm always kind of curious when that sort of thing bubbles up. So you started to touch on the power of poetry in this format, but on the writerly behind the scenes at the desk kind of side of things, um, how or why did you find yourself, crafting poems with this moment instead of capturing the narrative as a novel or a series of short stories? Why poetry, basically?
Yeah, I'm still asking that question myself because, I don't think of myself I still have a heart, even though I've got a book of poems now under my belt. I'm still struggling with that identity as a poet, because for, you know, 25 years, I saw myself as a fiction writer. Um, but, when my father started to get sick, he always woke up at 5 in the morning, right? That was just his routine, his ritual, call it what you will. And I started sort of finding value and wanting to honor that. So I started waking up at 5 a.m.
Wow.
And I, again, always begin my day reading as opposed to just writing. And I was reading poems. I was reading poems and poets who have also written about death and loss and grief. Whether or not it was Jack Gilbert was a great sort of muse for this book, Jim Harrison. Um, and so I'm reading these poems, and and it also sort of informing this book was something that I try to teach my students at whatever level, whether or not they're third graders or college students, is just something that Ray Carver said about make use of the world around you, put it all in. And me always preaching pay attention, Mary Oliver's motto about be astonished, tell about it, that sort of thing. So I'm always saying stuff, and then I was like kind of like hearing, when you teach yourself often. I'm sure you find that to be true too. And I was sort of asking myself, well, what am I paying attention to? What can I be astonished by? What can I be not afraid to look more closely at, even though I often wanted to turn away? And it was, so every morning I was just waking up thinking of my father, in his bed in the living room with the view of the river, and this river that sort of separates us. And that was the thing that, I was waking up to. So I just started paying attention to that. And I knew that I didn't want to I knew that I didn't want to write fiction about it. I knew I didn't want to adulterate the truth behind it in any kind of false way. I just wanted to be true, be honest, and honor it, and just become closer to that whole process of what was taking place. So, and as I'm reading poems, I just sort of like these poems started to be sort of compulsively generating themselves out of me. And I mean, I was writing. I've always been a pretty productive writer, whether or not I'm writing, and I'm always a very obsessive writer, whether I'm writing books about two boys or about a man who lives on a boat, and whatever the case may be. I'm my subject matter, once I find it, is usually very generous with me. So these poems just started tearing out of me. Um, some mornings, 3 at a time, and this book is, I think it's, some 90 pages, but, in my study here, there's another couple hundred poems that just got sort of whittled out because no one wants to read a 300-page book of poems about, the death of the father. So that's how these poems sort of, were born. And then now I don't have any interest in, or at least I haven't found that other book that's getting me to sort of turn back to fiction. It's sort of like I've heard a buddy of mine who recently wrote a book of nonfiction, Robert Lopez, who's a fiction writer too. And someone warned him, like, hey, once you start writing nonfiction, you're never going to go back. And that's certainly true right now of poems, because I'm still sitting down every morning and writing poems and not fiction. So I guess you just have to sort of take what is given to you, and hopefully one of these days I'll return to writing fiction, because reading from this book is not a pleasant experience for me. It's hard. It's like when I usually read in person, I usually apologize. I'll say, I don't know when the last time you saw a grown man cry, but get ready,
I mean, I'm not going to lie. I'm kind of happy that I told you beforehand, I always turn off my own screen and mic to make sure we have enough bandwidth for the reading. And it's probably just as well that the audience didn't see me during some of those moments. Cause like it's powerful stuff. Like it's impossible to listen to your poems and not confront your own, situation with
Yeah.
parents or yourself or whomever. Right. Like it
Yeah.
is, it's emotional work. If you're paying attention, you're going to have feelings.
Yeah. And I like the way that you as a reader are saying about, as writers, it's good to pay, and it's necessary to pay attention. But as a reader, I'm hoping that my reader pays attention. And then if you do pay attention, if I'm doing my job in attention paying and paying attention to the particulars of my experience, those will cross over into the universal and hopefully connect up with you and make you think of your own father, mother, loved ones. And
that's always the big unknown as a writer, right? Is like you don't know if your stuff is finding its reader. And that's one of the big mysteries on the writing side is, you do this hoping to be read, hoping to help people, hoping that the words get out there and make a difference. And you often never know if they do.
Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, well, I mean, the fiction will come back, right? You mentioned Jim Harrison, like he's also one of my kind of guide stones as a writer. Like he always did both, right? So the fiction and poetry both go.
Yeah, I prefer Harrison's poems. That's the work that I go back to, even though he was a huge influence on me as a fiction writer through I'd say his first 6, 7, 8 books of fiction. Those shaped me as a young writer, But now it's like, this was not set up, but like Harrison's Songs of Unreason is sitting right, right at my elbow. It's not his book, it's not Farmer or A Good Day to Die. I mean, as much as I haven't read those books in years, but I revisit his poems constantly. And I really think that he was, I think he identified as a poet more than anything else. And he probably wrote fiction just to sort of keep his wine cellar stocked.
The screenplays, right? He's not the only one. Like writers who do both will often say they identify as a poet who works in other forms as well. So I think that's
like Raymond Carver, who I mentioned earlier. I mean, most people just think of him as a short story writer, and that's really what he is known for. But I think his poem, again, I revisit his poems more than I do his fiction these days. And then when he was sort of confronting his own death and his own mortality, he was writing poems like that. He went back to, the way that he sort of entered into things, which most young writers start out writing poems, and then they gradually graduate to writing longer work and things like that. But I think for Carver, and I think Harrison too, that his last words that he died in his chair with was in the middle of a poem, and it's in the collected poems, and it's cool to see. And anyhow, so yeah, maybe I'll never go back, and that'll be fine too.
Well, yeah. I mean, you follow the muse wherever it takes you, right? Poems are outstanding, so if you stay with poetry, like we'll be happy. We in the audience will be happy either way. You've mentioned we are running out on time. I want to touch on the second question real quick. You've mentioned students a few times and teaching a few times, and I want to make sure we get InsideOut Literary Arts mentioned in this interview as well. So for the audience, Peter is involved in this nonprofit organization in the Detroit area to help student writers. So I was just wondering if you could talk to us, maybe tell us a little bit about that, but also how does the teaching side of things inform your own work as a writer? You mentioned a while ago that, we teachers tend to learn more by teaching others. We teach ourselves more than we often feel like we're teaching the crowd, so to speak. So how does your work with InsideOut Literary Arts inform you as teacher and writer?
Yeah, so I've been with InsideOut since its inception back in 1995. So I guess that brings us to what, 25, 20, I don't know what the math is, 20, over 2 decades I've been doing this. So And I've built my life around the act of teaching, which I just see as essential to myself as a writer. Like, to me, you often hear teachers of writing sort of complain about the fact that, I don't have enough time, I'm always teaching and things. For me, it's like, when I'm teaching, I'm actually writing more than when I'm not teaching. So working with whether or not it's third graders, which has sort of become my sort of wheelhouse lately, though I've worked, grades 1 through 12. I also teach out at Oakland University, which I really get a ton of pleasure out of that these days, because I haven't been doing it as long. I've only been doing that for 10 years. But, when you see a kid just sort of very much, kind of, you sort of open the door to them and say, you can close your eyes and see anything that you want, or, you set up this idea that there's this poetry portal that you can walk through and become whatever you want to be. It's just, it's inspiring to see kids catch fire and sort of come up with these really beautiful, at times, sometimes really surreal sentences or images. And what you model as the classroom teacher, they sort of see that as their opportunity to imitate, and but they always take it to the next level. And then they also can write from great honesty and great heart, which I've always learned from kids. Don't be afraid to be who you are and be open. They sort of, we unlearn that maybe, by the time we get to middle school and we start being self-conscious about our appearance and things like that. But that's what I love about the little kids. They're just sort of, they're unadulterated, about who they are, and they don't care if they say something silly or embarrassing. They're willing to live with it in a way that adults sometimes are afraid to. But yeah, that work has been very meaningful for me. And, I owe much of my adult life to Terry Blackhawk, who founded InsideOut. And when I was a very young writer, gave me an opportunity to see if I could do this thing and be any good at it. And it turns out that, I could do it, and I was good at it. And I've been doing it for all these years and continue to do it. So InsideOut is very much alive and thriving all these years later. And this is a book I wrote about sort of, it's a book. So I did write fiction. I wrote a book of nonfiction before the book of poems. But inside my pencil is the premise there is that I've had this pencil since I was in third grade, and you can look inside of it and see whatever you want to see, and it becomes true. And my students also have those pencils in their hands, and they're just ordinary pencils that, as long as you believe that it's endowed with some sort of magical power, then it does have some magical power. So that's, again, I think that's how I write fiction too. Just sort of like you see something and then you believe it, and then you play around with it some more until it actually, says something true, even though it's made up.
Yeah, you create it. That's the beauty.
Yeah. That's the idea. We're just making things up, or in this book of poems, I'm making up, I'm not inventing, but I'm making something that happened stay alive with me, or at least within my memory, my heart, the body that the book is, and it honors a body that's no longer with us.
Well, that's a beautiful note to end on. I think that was gorgeous. Thank you, Peter. Thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you for the poems. Thank you for the conversation. This has been an outstanding day. Thank you very much for doing it.
Thanks for doing what you do, Mitch.
No, thank you. Viewers, audience, thank you for joining us today, and we will see you next time.